906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Blades Bait and Tackle, your year-round connection to fishing bait Enoch. They're much more abundant than you may think, and they love it here in the UP. We'll take a look at salamanders.
And you rarely ever see them, so you can find them in ponds during the breeding season.
And we'll take a look at grafting apple trees. 9 million acres of forest, 1,700 miles of continuous shoreline, 4,300 lakes, 12,000 miles of streams, more than 300 waterfalls, 15 counties, 2 time zones, and 1 area code. Welcome to the Upper Peninsula. Welcome to 906 Outdoors. "906 Outdoors" is brought to you by Cooking Wild Seasonings. Make it fresh, make it yours. Last week, we took a look at a variety of springtime wetland inhabitants. That lineup of seldom seen critters was actually a bonus to what I initially set out to shoot. I wanted to find out more about salamanders. And as typically happens when I get together with ecologist Ryan Rutherford, I found out there is more than meets the eye.
So we're going to learn a lot about salamanders today. So right now I'm standing in an ephemeral pond, and what an ephemeral pond is it's a pool of water that doesn't hold water all year long. So a pond like this might hold water early on in spring after snowmelt, through May, through June, and then probably dry out sometime in August or later on in July. But what that means for salamanders is that there is no fish, because they would need a pond that's permanent, where there's water all year round, or a stream. So this is a unique environment in which salamanders can survive and fish are precluded. So early on in the springtime, after the snow melts, they'll migrate here, lay their eggs, and there's no fish to compete with them, so they tend to do really well. They feed on mosquito larvae, and you can see right here are some eggs. These are the eggs of the spotted salamander, one of our very first to come here and breed. They'll lay the egg mass and they'll deposit this jelly, and then as they lay it, the jelly will expand and take on water, so they end up becoming a lot larger than they originally were. You can see the little individual embryos around them too. If you look really closely, you can see an algae start to grow on the embryos. That's a kind of algae called salamander algae. It's actually only on salamander eggs. It's called Oophilia ambistomatalis, which directly means egg-loving mole salamander, which is what these guys are. They're in the mole salamander family. And these guys will stay in an egg form for just a few weeks, and then they'll hatch out into tiny little salamander larvae, and they'll develop over a period of a couple of months. They'll feed on small invertebrates in the water, and then they'll emerge normally mid-July to early August before the pond dries up. Now, so here's another spotted salamander egg mass. Another thing that's really interesting about these is they can withstand being out of the water for several days at a time. So this gelatinous coating around them keeps the embryos nice and moist. I've seen ponds that have dried up really early in the springtime and then had no water there for a week or more, and then they finally got rain, and they hatched and turned out just fine. So it's a pretty nice adaptation to changing conditions. That's where that algae starts to grow, and it can grow right inside of that jelly, and it provides oxygen for the growing embryos, and the algae get a place to reside during the process too. So it's thought to be a symbiotic partnership between the two species. So here are several egg masses here. These are all from the spotted salamander. You can see the middle one though is all kind of milky and murky, and this happens when you get an egg mass that's not fertilized. So you'll have a whole bunch of males come in here, and they'll be competing for the females. They will lay little structures on the bottom of the pond called spermatophores, and the females, if they're following that male, can come pick them up, and then they'll lay fertilized eggs. But sometimes an unfertilized egg mass gets laid, such as that. And if you come here on a night after a big rain early on in the spring, and they're all active, you can see them in the water churning around, coming up, and they kind of do this little dance that's called a Liebesspiel courtship dance, where they'll come up, get a gulp of air, and go walk around on the bottom. To see a whole bunch of them together is pretty amazing. So right here we're seeing a really high abundance of blue spotted salamander eggs. Look at these branches, they're absolutely covered with eggs. Hundreds and hundreds. So unlike the spotted salamander, blue spotted salamanders will lay several small clusters. So you'll get clusters of just 2, 3, 5, maybe 10 eggs, but there'll be a whole bunch of them. So they have a much different appearance. They can cover complete branches like this. And the larvae that hatch out of there are strictly predatory. They have gills and they have very large mouths that they'll use to consume invertebrates. So they don't eat plant material or anything like that. They're entirely carnivorous, and they grow really fast. And they'll sprout 2 little front legs, and then by the time that they get close to developing, they'll sprout their back legs. They'll absorb the gills into their body, and they'll come out just like mini adult salamanders. These are the eggs of the spotted salamander, which is black with yellow spots. So these guys are amazingly cold tolerant. They'll walk to these ponds over the snow and deposit the eggs here, and they deposit them in these large masses. At least this species does. And you can easily recognize the difference between these ones here and these eggs right next to them, which are much looser. Notice how these are much looser and they're in smaller clusters. These are the eggs of the similar blue-spotted salamander. You can see how they hang like jelly. They're pretty easy to tell apart. So in ephemeral ponds here in the UP, there are generally 3 salamanders that you look for early on in the springtime. We have the spotted, the blue-spotted salamanders, and you can easily recognize their egg masses. The one that's trickier to find is the four-toed salamander, and they prefer areas like this. So they like it where you have moss sticking up out of the pond, and they'll lay their eggs directly in the moss. So we look for them just by looking in the moss like this. They're really unique among our salamander species in that they prefer to nest right here in this moss just above the water line. Where other salamanders will lay eggs directly in the water, they'll lay theirs right on the moss here. And so you just look in the moss right here, and there's one right here. Oh, she's diving under a little bit. You can see her up there. She is. Look at that. Pretty widespread in the UP, but few people ever get to see these because they're so difficult to find unless you know exactly where to look. And this is a female. You can tell because she has a really thick body. She'll lay her eggs right here in this moss, and she can move them up and down depending on the changing water level. And she'll stay with them for over a month. And these guys are in the lungless salamander family Plethodontidae. So they don't have any lungs. They're able to absorb all the oxygen that they need directly through their skin, which keeps their size pretty small, and it makes them have to stay in a moist environment for their entire lives. So this whole area was glaciated 10,000 years ago, and there weren't any salamanders here. And these guys had to walk all the way here from the southern US, probably from the Appalachian Mountains, which is currently the hotspot for salamander diversity on planet Earth. And this species still occurs down there now. And if I flip her over, you can see the belly pattern, which is really distinct. We don't have another salamander like this. Another thing that's unique about them is they have a constriction right here on their tail that can actually snap off. If a predator were to grab this, she could snap it off, and that part of the tail would regrow. And if you look on her face, you can see little structures right around her nostrils that they use to detect chemical cues. So these guys live in a chemical environment. Now, as humans, we're pretty visual animals. We detect most of what we see by sight, some by smell. We don't have a very good sense of chemical detection, but this allows them to detect substances in the water. It detects where other salamanders are. So they're pretty cued into their chemical environment, which is pretty true for a lot of amphibians. So part of my work has been a UP-wide herp survey, and before starting our work, these were only known from 7 counties in the UP, and now they're known from all 15. This is currently listed on the regional forest or sensitive species list for our national forest, but there's some pretty healthy populations there, but they are really pure and pristine environments. And this forest that we're in here underneath hemlock trees provides a cool year-round climate for this particular species that they just love. So this water is going to stay nice and cool all summer because of our overstory. So several of these hemlocks are probably pretty old. And this is going to really influence the water temperature down here.
906 Outdoors is brought to you in part by Christ, your Northwoods neighborhood store.
So this is the lovely spotted salamander. They're in the mole salamander family. Salamanders are a group of animals that have been around on planet Earth for a very long time, hundreds of millions of years. They were animals that looked very similar to this at the same time that we had dinosaurs. And they're very good at detecting chemical cues. You see there's a lot of pits right around their snout that they'll use to pick up on the presence of other members of their same species. They can detect chemicals in the water. And this species, you can even identify individuals by the spot pattern on their back. They're a long-lived species. Individual can live over a decade, which for an amphibian is a pretty long time. And you rarely ever see them, so you can find them in ponds during the breeding season. The best way to find them is to go out at night with a flashlight in ephemeral ponds. And if you get there during a breeding aggregation, you'll see quite a display. They do a courtship dance where they'll crawl along the bottom. They'll come up and gulp for air and go back down again in large groups. And it looks like they're dancing. And at any given time, there are more males than females at a breeding site. The females will come, they'll pick up a packet of sperm from a male, they'll lay their eggs, and then they will leave, where the males will tend to stay around longer. So this is probably a male. They've been breeding in this pond for a little while now. But during the summertime, they go underground. That's why they call them mole salamanders. They spend a lot of time in the ground, and they're inactive for a good portion of the year, but they do come out and are most active early on in the spring. They're also an excellent habitat indicator. They're a sign of good, healthy water quality. Even though they're rarely seen, they're actually very abundant in the UP, where you have a lot of ponds and hardwood forest. And he's moving because he doesn't really like the sun. They are mostly nocturnal when they're active on the surface, and then when they're not active on the surface, they're underground. So it probably looks extremely bright to them. You can see the ribs too, right through the skin. They call those grooves coastal grooves, and that's a good way to identify them. Oh, as if the spots wasn't obvious enough, but other salamanders that are more difficult to ID, you can tell by counting those grooves. So this is our other common mole salamander species. This is the blue-spotted salamander. It's much skinnier than the spotted, and you can see the blue flecks all over its bodies. And they also come out very early on in the springtime, lay their eggs in ponds. But these guys tend to stay more on the surface and go underground less frequently than the spotted salamander. One of their defense displays is to gently move their tail. You can see this one's probably a little bit agitated, and they'll sometimes emit kind of a latexy, waxy substance that's very unpleasing to predators. So it's one of their defenses. And these guys can be really abundant. This salamander is probably more tolerant to disturbance than other species. He'll venture a little bit further from the forest than the spotted salamander, and they can also be in more heavily managed, modified landscapes, even ponds within cities. So a pretty adaptable species. So not all of our salamander species are tied to wetlands. We do have one species that does not have a stage that lives in the water, and that's the redback salamander. And they prefer forests like this. This is a northern hardwood forest. It's dominated by sugar maples and yellow birches. So we're going to flip some logs, and then that's the preferred habitat. So they can be really abundant in this habitat, but they can be a little bit tricky to find. So this is the amazing redback salamander, and they're in the lungless salamander family. They are able to obtain all of their oxygen right through their skin, which keeps them attached to moist environments. But the really unique thing about these guys is they live only in upland forests, so they're not aquatic species. And these guys can be extremely abundant. There was a study done in the same sort of habitat, northern hardwood forest in New Hampshire, that found that this one species of salamander, if you weighed up every individual for that forest, it weighed as much as all the mammals and was twice that of all the birds, which is incredibly amazing. So they're an important member of our leaf litter duff community within forests. They also have the ability to lose their tail and regrow it, and I can tell that's happened to this individual here. You can see originally its tail would have been all red, but then it must have broke off and then it grew back. It grew back this more gray color. And they normally live inside logs, under leaves, and they feed on small critters, small invertebrates. In really moist conditions, if it's raining, they can come out at night, and they can even crawl up into trees and shrubs. I'm not sure how high they can climb, but they don't stay just down in the leaf litter. So they're important little micro predators in our forest communities. And they're also a good indicator of good forest management. So if all the downwoody debris is gone, if there's no logs and sticks within a particular forest, these salamanders can be quite rare. In older forests or forests that are well managed, that leave a lot of that downwoody material, they can be extremely abundant. If you look inside this salamander, this is a female, you can see the developing eggs in there, and she'll lay these eggs inside this log later on in the summer and will stay there and guard them until they hatch. That abdomen is somewhat translucent. You can see the inside the salamander right through the skin.
Today's show is brought to you in part by Rapid River Knife Works, home of Michigan's largest custom knife factory showroom. If you're considering planting apple trees at home or at camp, here's some tips about grafting that you need to know.
Most years I like to do some grafting, you have to buy the rootstocks. Again, the rootstock you want the tree to grow on, the characteristics that you want. You try growing a Cortland tree from a seed from a Cortland apple, you will not get a Cortland apple. Apple trees have to cross-pollinate, and you get a mix of genetics, and you'll get something entirely different. If you want a Cortland tree, you have to basically clone the tree, and you do that by cutting off a branch on the Cortland tree. And what you want is last year's growth. Now this happens to be last year's growth. A pretty strong growth, and you can always tell where the growth started. First of all, there's a little difference in color. It's going to be a little darker, last year's growth. Then there'll be a little bit of a ring around the branch where last year's growing started. So you cut that off. These are all buds that are possible for grafting. I like a decent size thickness because, as you'll see, the rootstocks come on generally a thicker stem than this, but it's hard to find a diameter bigger than this. So you work with what you got, and it should have good sun exposure so that the buds are nice and strong. Okay, what I've got here is some grafting wax that I'm heating up. Back in early March, I went out and cut some cyanwood. These happen to be Zestar. Zestar has a patent on it that hasn't expired yet, so I have to pay a royalty for every tree that I graft. When I first started doing this, and I haven't been doing it too many years, I used the traditional method, which was to take a knife and cut at a slant. Cut the cyanwood at a slant. This is the rootstock. Cut a matching notch or slant on the rootstock, and then notch the cut here, corresponding notch on here, fit them together. Well, the very first tree I tried, I cut my thumb. And I said, that's enough of that. So what I did is I went out and bought a grafting tool, and this really works nice. The first thing I'm going to do is find a couple good buds, and there are a lot of them on this branch. You don't want the ones down close to last year's growth or too close, and you don't want the ones on the end because these would be undeveloped buds. You want something in this range. What I do is I pick out a nice fat bud, and I cut below that. I've got to get it nice and square on there. I guess you call that an omega style cut. I want to leave 2 or 3 buds, which I hope will sprout. So I cut the branch off above that top bud. Now we've got exposed stem, and I gotta wax that to keep it from drying out. Make sure it's covered good, and make a corresponding cut on the rootstock. This happens to be a G41 rootstock out of Geneva, New York. Ideally, you want identical diameters. At least 90% of the time they aren't. My little branch is smaller than the rootstock. Okay, I'm going to make a cut here, and I got to make sure I'm going in the right direction, that I don't do it upside down. Okay, now I've got a matching cut. Slide the two together. You want the cambium layers to line up. Now, because the cyanwood is more narrow than the rootstock, you want a good match on one side. Of course, they're not lined up on here, but all you need is to have good contact on one side. What I'm going to do now is put grafting wax all the way around. You got to seal it up so that it doesn't dry out. Now, this is a different technique than what I've used in the past. I always used to use electrician's tape. So I said, I'm going to try this technique right here and use graft wax on this as well. And I think it's going to work. Well, time will tell. This is my 100th one here this spring, and I started a couple of weeks ago, an hour or two at a time. And as soon as you can work the dirt, which is now, I will go out and plant them in my orchard pretty close together. Weeding is a problem, as you can imagine. So I'll plant them about 12 inches apart, and I've got 3 buds exposed. When they get about that long, I choose the longest one and I leave it on there and I rub off the other 2 because you only want 1 stem growing. And so you keep it weeded, keep it watered, and the first year, if you're fortunate, you'll get growth about 10 inches. And you got to keep the rabbits away, keep the mice away, however you can do that. And the second year, it'll grow a bit more. And by the third year, you can plant it out in its permanent spot. So it's very simple process. It's kind of fun to do, to create your own trees. And it's especially nice if you've got, I've had a number of people say that, there's an apple tree on my grandpa's farm that I remember picking apples there 40 years ago. I'd like to save that tree. Well, this is one way you can do it. Take a cutting during the dormant season, get a hold of a rootstock, whether you want dwarf, semi-dwarf, whatever, and go ahead and graft. It's kind of fun to do.
Feel free to join us on Facebook or visit us at 906outdoors.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up to get on the 906 Outdoors email list. We'll send you an occasional email with tips, recipes, and more. You'll also be eligible for giveaways just for being on the list. Thanks for watching, and we invite you to join us next week for another adventure right here on 906 Outdoors.